As you may have noticed, our Vuex files have become quite large. This is a sign that it is time to split up the store into modules. As you may know, Vuex allows us to divide our store into modules, where each module can contain its own state, mutations, actions, getters, and even nested modules. Modularizing the whole store can be a long and tiresome process that sometimes is necessary. I highly recommend that you used namespace modules from the early stages of your application if there is a chance for your application to grow. Let's get started by creating a directory under the store to put our modules in. To begin with, I will create a module for the threads. I will name this file threads.js. Modules just export an object with their state, getters, actions, and so on. When we work with modules, we have two states. We have the global root state that is defined in the index file. And we also have a separate local state, one for each module. Vuex modules receive their local state as the first argument in the mutations and getters, where you normally see the root state come in. Right now, the root state includes the threads property that should be moved to the threads module's local state. Even though this is valid, in order to access the threads outside of the module, we will need to go to state.threads to access the module, and then .threads to get to the threads inside of its state. Because this looks a little weird, I like to name this property items. Other common conventions are all or cached. Feel free to use whichever one you like the best. So, from now on, we will access the threads outside of the module under state.threads.items. Cool. Let's move on to the getters. In the getters file, there is a thread getter that should go into the threads module. Since we renamed the threads property to items in the module's local state, here we should use items in order to access the specified thread. Also, we need access to the findById helper function, so let's import it now. Next up, let's see which actions are related to the threads. The createThread action definitely belongs to the threads module. Once I move it, VS Code complains because we have to import the Firebase library. The next action we should move is update thread. Now, VS Code is complaining that the doc2resource function is undefined. Let's import it. Lastly, we have the fetch actions to fetch one or multiple resources. Some people prefer to name the module actions fetch item and fetch items accordingly, but I prefer to specify the resource in the action name so that I can find them easily. And that's it for the actions. Lastly, we have to move the thread-related mutations. The only mutations we have about threads are related to multiple resources. For instance, append post to thread has to do with both a thread and a post. The assets, like mutations and actions that interact with multiple resources, should be registered globally. So perhaps we can leave these here. Though this is actually not the case for these mutations. If we take a closer look, we can see that the append child to parent mutation only updates the parent. So, append post to thread will update only a thread, and thus we should move it to the threads module. Now we don't have access to the make append child to parent mutation function, since it's declared in the mutations file. Since we will need this function in multiple modules, I will extract it to the helper file. I will also change the syntax to use the arrow syntax to be consistent with the other exported helper functions. If you remember, the only reason we used the traditional function declaration syntax was to take advantage of hoisting, but that's no longer necessary. Back to our module, we can now import the helper function. Next, we have the append contributor to thread that appends a user ID to a thread. So this one belongs in the threads module as well. At this point, it's fairly easy to spot these mutations that belong to the threads by checking the parent option. With that, append thread to forum would go in the forums module, and append thread to user in the users module. Okay, so now we have all the mutations that update the thread state living in the threads module. Since we renamed the threads property to items, we now have to update all the instances of state.threads to state.items. Remember that here the state is the local module state, so it includes only the items property. The mutations we have here are created by our helper function, so we will have to update this function as well to take into account .items. We will do that after we split the whole store into modules. Alright, now I'm going to do the same thing I did for threads to each of the other resources, that is, posts, forums, categories, and users. I won't make you watch that though. You can find all the code changes in the lesson's source code. Alright, I have created a module for each of the resources and did the same work we did for the threads. Even though authentication is not a resource like threads or posts, it's still handy to have the whole logic inside of a module. Let's do that together. I will create a new module. For the auth module, we don't have items in the state like we do with the other resources, but we do have some auth related state that we're keeping up with. We have auth ID, auth user unsubscribe, and the auth observer unsubscribe. Let's move those over into the module. Next, we have the auth user getter. Then, in the actions file, we have a bunch of actions related to authentication. Let's also import Firebase here. Lastly, we have three mutations that deal with auth. Sweet, we have managed to split the store into our modules. The rest of the mutations and actions should stay global, since they are used in multiple modules and don't relate to any one multiple resource. Lastly, let's import all the modules into the store index file and register them in the modules option. We still have some ways to go yet before our forum starts working again, but we'll work on that more in the next lesson. In the last lesson, we began the process of migrating our Vuex store to modules. Let's continue doing that in this video. I'd like to use namespaces in all of our modules so that actions, mutations, and getters inside of the modules are not registered under the global namespace. The benefit of this is that you can't accidentally commit a mutation, dispatch an action, or get a getter from a different module, and you don't have to worry about naming collisions. Making those connections across modules will take some extra, intentional effort. To namespace a module, we have to set the namespace property to true. Let's do that in all of the modules. Alright, it's time to start refactoring our module's code. I will start with the thread module. Inside of our thread getter, we access the users in the state. However, since we're now in a namespaced module, there is no state.users. The only state that exists in this module is items. So, instead of looking in the thread state for the users, we need to look in the state of the users module. We can do this by accessing the root state and looking for the items in the users module. Root state is available as a third argument on our getter. And then we need to look in the root state under the user's namespace for its items. Cool. Now we need to do something similar for the actions that we dispatch and the mutations that we commit inside the modules. Let's start with the committed mutations. In all cases where we call commit, if the mutation doesn't exist inside of the current module, we need to call it with its namespace prefix and provide a root argument as the third option. So, on the set item mutation, we need to add root true as the third argument. And since the set item mutation is in the global namespace, we don't have to prefix it with anything. For append thread to user and append thread to forum, we also need to add the root true option. But this time, we also need to prefix the mutation names with the appropriate module namespace. Let's do the same thing for the remaining commits. Great, that takes care of the committed mutations. Now we can do similar for the actions that are dispatched. Create post is in the posts module, so it should be prefixed with posts slash. And we need to provide root true. Fetch item and fetch items are both defined in the global namespace, so they just need root true. Cool. I think that should do it for the threads module. Let's move on now to the auth module. In the auth user getter, we are accessing a user getter. Since the getters inside of namespace modules will only give us local getters, we need to change this. Just like there is a root state, there is also a root getters. And it is available via a fourth argument on the getter. Unlike root state, however, we don't use a dot to separate the module from the state. Instead, we use this slash syntax in order to look in the module and then in the getter. Now, let's do the same thing for the commits and dispatches that we did in threads. The set auth observer unsubscribe mutation is defined in the current module, so we can leave it as is. So is the auth ID mutation, so it's good as it is. And this one's still good. Same namespace. This one's good. Alright. Set item is in the global namespace, so we don't need the namespace prefix, but we do need to specify root true. And lastly, this one's still in the same namespace, so it's good. Now, let's look for the instances of dispatch. No change here, as this one's local. Same here. Create user, however, is defined in the user module. So let's namespace it and pass it root true. And again, and fetch item just needs to have root true, as it's in the global namespace. Alright, that brings us back to our first one. So nice. I think we're done with the auth module. Let's move on now to categories. Here, we dispatch the fetch item and fetch items actions. These actions are global and do not belong to any module, so they just need the root true option. In this action, we commit the set item mutation, which is also global, so we will pass the root true option. Now, before we move to the next module, let's take some time to update the global mutations and helpers, starting with the set item mutation. Here, we upsert a document to the list of resources. That list of resources once existed directly on the state, but now it exists as items in the state of each individual module. Cool, easy enough. Next, we have the make append child to parent mutation in the helper file. Here, the returned function will be a mutation inside of a module. So, the state argument will be the module's local state. Therefore, we don't need to know the parent. We can just directly access the items. Good. Next up, we have the forms module. Here, we have just two actions that both dispatch a global action. So, we have to pass root true, and we're good to go. Next up, the posts module. In this module, we have some work to do. Starting with the create post action, we commit a couple of mutations that do not belong in the posts module. The global set item mutation needs root. Then the append posts a thread belongs to the threads module and needs root. This mutation also belongs to the threads module. Finally, we commit set item one more time in the update post method. Let's mark that one with root true. For dispatching, we only call two global actions. So once again, we'll provide root true. We also access state.authID several times throughout this module. We'll have to change that to root state.auth.authID. For actions, we can access the root state via the context parameter. We also need the root state in the update post action. Phew, okay, only one module left, the users module. We call commit twice in this file. Both commit the set item mutation, so we need to pass root true. Dispatch is called twice, once for fetch item and once for fetch items. Let's add root true to both of these. Lastly, inside of the user getter, we look for the posts and the threads related to the user in the state. Let's switch those to root state and get the items from the proper module. Alright, folks, with that, we have managed to split our store into namespaced modules. It was quite a ride, but really it wasn't that difficult. There was a pattern to follow, even though it took some time. I don't know what we might have missed, but we will find out in the next lesson, where we'll go over the components and update the way we interact with the store. After modularizing the store, we have to update all the references in our application and in the components. Before we start updating the page components, let's update the global files like the router file, the navbar, and app.view. Here in the router file, we dispatch the fetch thread action. So we need to provide the namespace. Since we're not inside of a Vuex module, we don't need to provide the root true option because we're already in the global namespace. We also look at the threads in the state. Let's look for those under .items. In the before enter navigation guard on the sign-out route, we dispatch the sign-out action. This exists inside of the auth module. Lastly, in the global navigation guard, we dispatch two actions. One is under the auth namespace. The next unsubscribe all snapshots action is global. So it's good. We should also modify how we're accessing the auth ID here. We'll look for it under the auth module. Same thing for this line. Great, that should do it for the router file. Now let's go to the navbar. In the navbar, we use the auth user getter to access a namespace getter using map getters. One option is to pass the namespace right before the getter's name. We also dispatch an action to sign the user out. So let's pass the namespace here as well. Okay, now in app.view, we map the fetch auth user action. Just like the auth user getter a second ago, we can provide the namespace as the first argument to the map actions function. Okay, I think we're good with these global files. Let's jump into the home page. If we visit it in the browser, we get some hints on what we have to fix. The first error is unknown action type, unsubscribe auth user snapshot. Let's make sure the call to that is namespaced. It also seems we have to do the same for fetch auth user. That removes those errors. Next, fetch all categories is having issues. Let's namespace that in the homepage component. One option to map namespaced actions is to pass the namespace right before the array with the actions, as we did in app.view. Since the array here includes two actions that belong to different modules, we can call map actions one time for the categories module and then one for the forums. We also access the categories from the state in a computed property of this component. After modularizing the store, state.categories contains the whole state of the categories module. So, to get the actual categories, we have to reference the items property. Let's check back in the browser. This $store.state.forums.filter is not a function. This comes from the category list component. Let's add the necessary .items here. Nice, we've made some progress. We can now see the full home page. Let's check the category page. Unknown action type, fetch category. Let's mount the namespaced actions on the category page. Since we are here, let's also update the category computed property. And we also access the state down on line 36. Let's nest down into items once again. Great, we've got the category page back as well as the home page. Now let's proceed to a forum page. Unknown action type, fetch forum. We know how to fix that by now. Notice how we benefit from using the Vuex helpers, and we don't have to look for and update the actions in multiple places in each component. Let's also fix the computed properties here. We could map this getter to access it via the namespace, like we did for the actions, but since it's not already mapped, let's just access it directly here. We just look under the namespace, like so. Let's see where that gets us. Resources.find is not a function. This is in threadlist.view. Let's go check that out. There are two computed properties here that rely on the store that need to be updated. And with that, the forum page is fixed. Let's go now to the thread page. Here we see unknown action type, fetch thread. Let's go ahead and fix that, as well as the other issues we know that are going to pop up. We'll namespace the getter, and the computed properties will add .items to each of those. Nothing new here. And namespace this getter. Also, under the methods, we're mapping those actions. Before we go to the browser, let's check the post list and post editor component, as they are used on this page. In this file, we have a few instances of the $store variable. Let's resolve those. We also have one action. Nice. Let's check the post editor component. It already looks good. We shouldn't have to make any changes here. Alright, let's check it out in the browser. Awesome. Everything is working. Let's also try to create and edit a post. Sweet. Everything's working. Looking good. Let's move now to the thread edit page. We'll take care of the usual changes. Now, if I go to a thread that I created and click on Edit Thread, whoop, we still have one more issue in threads.js. It says it's on line 65. Yeah, that's because this post here needs to be found not from state.post, but from root state.posts. Alright, let's try again. Whoop, we still got an issue. Oh, of course, this should be .items. And third time's a charm. Awesome, that worked. We're getting close. Let's tackle thread create. I will do the usual changes here. This needs .items. Our actions need to be namespaced. Alright, let's give it a try. Whoops, there's some kind of error going on there. Let's check the create thread action. Ah, yes, right here we're still looking for the auth ID under the state. Let's change that to look under the root state and then the auth module. There we go. Even though this refactor is quite tiresome, I'm sure you've noticed that the changes are really kind of easy to spot and implement since we have a well structured component system. If we had used namespace modules from the beginning, though, we'd have done ourselves a big favor. Okay, we're getting so close to finishing. Let's check the profile page and do the refactor. We'll namespace the getter and the dispatch of our action. Here, we also have to update the user profile card editor. It dispatches the update user action that needs to be namespaced. Cool. Lastly, let's update the auth related pages. This needs namespaced, as does this, and same thing in register.view. Great. I will sign out, create a new account, then sign out, and try to log in again. Awesome. The whole auth process works fine. I think that does it for refactoring the Vuex store into modules. I'm sure that you've noticed that once we open the user dropdown, it stays open, like forever. What we'd expect to happen is for it to close when we click anywhere outside of the dropdown menu. In order to implement that, let's create a custom directive. While we could grab some off the shelf solution from NPM, I want to show you how you can wire this up yourself so that you'll be able to write your own custom directives in the future if needed. However, for most real world situations, I would definitely grab an existing package. First off, what is a view directive? A directive is any of those attributes we add to the elements in the template that start with a V. For example, von, v4, or vif. But we're not limited to just using the built in directives. We can create custom ones for specific use cases. So, we want to create a custom directive, v click outside, and on click outside, we want to set the user dropdown open data to false. And actually, there's a caveat to custom directives. We cannot use expressions like this in custom directives like we do in von to change the component's data, because the scope is not the same. Instead, we should pass functions. These could be methods defined on the component, or they could even be anonymous functions if we only want to execute a simple expression. That's what we'll do. Note that I'm adding this to the A tag surrounding the dropdown trigger, as well as the dropdown itself, because if I added it only to the dropdown, clicking on the trigger would cause the drop-down to close, effectively making it impossible to ever open the drop-down. Alright, let's make this directive actually work. In order to keep this directive definition isolated and organized, we'll register it using a plugin. If you remember from making the Font Awesome plugin, a View plugin is nothing more than a function that accepts the View application instance. And in order to register a directive, we call the directive method on app, which takes the name of the directive and the directive itself. We don't have to prefix the name with v dash. This is done automatically by View. Cool. Now let's define that directive. Just like a component goes through some lifecycle hooks, so do directives. And in View 3, they've been renamed to better match up with the component lifecycle hooks. So, the two that we are concerned with are mounted and unmounted. In mounted, we will set up our event listeners on the document to listen for a click outside of the element with the directive. And on unmounted, we will clean up the event listener, just as we would want to do in a component. First, let's fill out mounted. Mounted receives the element the directive is used on as the first argument. And secondly, the binding. The binding is an object with some helpful data, like the component instance and the value provided to the directive. Now, let's set up an event listener on the document body. Inside the event listener, we'll check to see if the element clicked on was the same as the element with the directive on it, or if it's an element nested inside of the element with the directive on it. And if it's not, we can call the function passed as the value of the directive. Cool. Now let's extract that to a named function so that we can remove the event listener. And actually, let's define it as a method on the element itself. That way we can access it in the unmounted hook to remove it. I've used these underscores in the method name to prevent clashes with other properties and methods defined on the element, since there's more of a chance of clashing here with other plugins and such. Then, in unmounted, we can remove the event listener. Great, that should get us a working custom click outside directive. Let's go over to main.js and use our plugin, and we should be good to go. Back in the browser, we've got a dropdown that closes as expected. If you want to know more about custom Vue.js directives, you can read up on the official documentation provided in the links below. In this lesson, we will make our navbar work on mobile. When I set the device on DevTools to a phone, notice that we have this nice hamburger menu However, when I click it, nothing happens. Here, we see that in order to open the navbar, we need to add the class navbar_open. So, when a user clicks on the hamburger, we should toggle this class, and it will be good to go. This is very similar to how the user dropdown works. I will add a data property to know when the navbar is open. Now, I will conditionally append the navbar_open class based on our flag. Sweet! Let's add the toggle functionality to the hamburger. Let's give it a shot in the browser. That's nice. Now, when the user is logged in, the mobile navbar will be empty. This is because the user dropdown is only designed for desktop. What we can do for that is to add a link for the profile page and one for signing out, and give them the class of navbar mobile item that will hide the links on the desktop. Please notice here that these class names are specified by our designer, so if you want to do the same in another application, make sure to create the corresponding classes. And of course, we only want to show them when the auth user exists. Okay, cool. We also want to close the mobile nav when users click outside of our header. To do that, we can use our click outside directive. Back in the browser, we have a nice and simple mobile navigation. And actually looking at it now, I think it would be nice to close the navigation whenever the user changes routes, so that it won't linger after you've clicked a navigation item. We can do this with a route guard. And since the sign out navigation item isn't actually changing routes, in order for this to work, we need to either manually set mobile nav open to false or make it just change navigation. I'll just make the sign out also redirect us to the home page so that the before each navigation guard will fire. We can do this by calling router.push after we dispatch sign out. You can actually call multiple expressions in a v_on by separating them with a comma. And I'll do the same thing for the sign out button for mobile. This should do it. Now, clicking outside of the nav will close it, and navigating to another page will also close it. Another situation where we might want to close the mobile nav bar is when users scroll the page. Let's create another custom directive to handle that. We'll call this one page scroll. Now, let's create the page scroll directive file in the plugins directory. Here, we'll export the function to make the plugin, just like we did before. And we'll create the directive. This directive's job is to call the past expression when the user scrolls, right? So, on mounted, we will assign the binding value to a property on the element. Then, we will add a scroll event listener to the document and pass it the function. Lastly, we will clean up the event listener in unmounted. Before we check it out in the browser, we need to import it and then use it in main.js. Back in the browser, when we are on mobile and scroll down, the navbar closes. Awesome. While this works great, there's always one thing you need to be aware of when working with scroll events. They fire, like, a lot. To demonstrate that, let me add a console log to the page scroll. Scrolling here at a leisurely pace gives us 84 times the function fired. We don't really need it to fire that often. A common solution to this issue is called debouncing. Debouncing a function means to limit it to only a single call within a specified time frame. So, we can debounce our page scroll function to only happen, say, maybe once every 200 milliseconds, instead of the 84 or so times we saw just now. Since debouncing is a common need, there are plenty of libraries out there that handle it. I'm used to using the debouncing function from Lodash, so let's install that. I'll install it by typing npm install Lodash --save. For those of you not familiar with Lodash, it's a popular JavaScript utility library that provides a wealth of utility functions. You may be thinking, why in the world would you install so many utility functions when all you need is a single debounce function? Well, that's one of the great parts about creating our project with Webpack. If we only import the debounce function from Lodash, then the debounce function is the only thing from Lodash that gets bundled into our application's JavaScript file. And should we need any of Lodash's other functions in the future, we can just cherry pick the ones we want. Alright, let's import the debounce function. Now, to use it, we provide the function we want to debounce as the first argument, and the time frame in milliseconds as the second argument. Cool. Now let's see how often it fires. Nice. Only one time. And when we scroll back up to the top, you can see that the nav is closed. I don't like, though, how the nav didn't disappear right away. We can fix that by passing the leading option to the debounce function. This says invoke the function first, then do the timeout, as opposed to the default of doing the timeout, then invoking the function. This time, it closes right away and still fires only twice. While this use case might not warrant debouncing, as our function doesn't do a whole lot, debouncing scroll events is a good habit to get into, as they have the real potential of causing performance issues. Right now, on the user profile page, we are fetching every single post the user has ever posted. On our test application, it's not that big of a deal because we have a limited number of test posts. However, in a real world application, depending on how active the user is on the forum, this could be hundreds or even thousands of posts. Loading in all these posts at one time is not practical, as it would cause ever increasing performance issues. So, let's paginate them. First off, what is pagination? Pagination is when we fetch a list of data one page at a time. A page is just an arbitrary number of items. It could be 10 of them, 15 of them, or even 50 of them. The point is just that we're not loading all the data at once. Pagination could take the form of an infinite scroll, like on Giphy.com. Notice when I get to the bottom, it loads in some more items. That's a new page of GIFs. Or your pagination might take on a more traditional form and look like the pagination on this recipe website. Okay, so in order to paginate the data from the Cloud Firestore, we need to combine two Firestore methods, limit and start after. Limit takes a number indicating how many records should be returned, while start after takes a records document indicating at what point the page should begin. We'll also want to use an order by method so that we can paginate in a predictable order. Okay, let's try that out. I've opened up auth.js, and here we're in the fetch auth users post action. This is the action that fetches the user's post for the profile page. First, let's add order by and tell Firestore that we want the posts with the most recent post first, and then have them descending in order over time. Then, let's say that we'll limit each page to 10 items. At this time, we'll just pretend we're only concerned about the very first page, so we won't implement the start after method yet. So, as the code is right now, when I open up the browser, what I'd expect to see is my latest 10 posts. Let's see if that's what we get. And no dice. We've got an error. This query requires an index. You can create it here. If you're coming from working with a relational database like SQL, this error might just throw you for a loop. The issue here is that in order to boost performance, Firestore does not crawl through the entire database item by item to get the results of a query. Instead, it searches through indexes for all queries. Much like the index of a book, which maps topics in a book to page numbers, a database index maps the items in a database to their locations in the database. For simpler, single-field queries, Firestore can generate these indexes automatically. That's why our query for the user's posts that just used where user ID equals auth user ID worked just fine. However, now we've added another field to the query, the published at for ordering. This means our query now requires what the Firestore calls a composite query, and these are not automatically generated for us. What is given to us is this nice handy link to have it generated. Let's click it. Now, all we have to do is click Create Index, and the Cloud Firestore will do all the hard work for us. Depending on the size of the database, this can take a bit of time, but when it's done, building will change to Enabled. Feel free to pause the video and come back when the Firestore is done creating the index. Now, with our index created, the user's profile page should be back again. Nice. And you'll notice that we only have the latest 10 posts. Before this lesson, I reseeded the database and manually added in 24 new posts, numbering them as I went. And 24 is in fact at the top, descending down to 15. Perfect. Now all we need is a way to tell the Firestore where to start subsequent pages, and a mechanism for switching between the different pages. Let's work on using the Start After method to tell Firestore where to start the page. Remember, Start After takes the Firestore document that you want the page of resources to start after. In other words, it wants the last post fetched in the current page. But what is that post? Well, let's create a computed property on the profile page in order to get that for us. First, if there are no posts at all, then the last post fetched is null. Otherwise, the last fetched post is the post at the index that is one less than the length of the user's .posts array. Cool. Now let's pass that to the fetch auth user posts action. And now we'll need to update the action to be able to accept that input. Now, we should update the query itself to use the provided Start After document. However, sometimes Start After is null, that is, for the first page. So, we only need to add the Start After method if Start After is not null. In order to do that, we'll temporarily store the query in a variable, and then call .get on the query to get the posts. In between, if Start After is not null, then we'll add it to the query. And query should be defined using let, not const, because we have to redefine it here. And one more thing we'll want to do here is actually get the Start After document as an actual Firestore document. We can do that by fetching the document afresh by its ID. Remember, the posts stored in our Vuex store have been transformed with the doc to resource function and are no longer Firestore documents. That's why this is necessary. Alright, now let's make it so that we can actually call a page other than the first page. Just so that we can quickly see if this works, I'll use a set timeout to just call page 2. Let's say 2 seconds after page 1. Whoops, we get an error. That's because I forgot to await the result of the query. Alright, now if I refresh the page, scroll quickly to the bottom, and wait for a second or two, you'll see the scroll bar jump, and our new posts are automatically added. Nice. Let's remove that timeout, as it was just for testing. In the next lesson, we'll use an intersection observer to create an infinite scroll effect so that each page is automatically added to the end of the list of posts when the user scrolls to the end. In the last lesson, we got the posts on the user's profile page paginated, but currently we're only supporting the first page. We need some kind of trigger to tell the browser to fetch subsequent pages. Well, on the user profile page, let's do an infinite scroll option like we saw used on Giphy.com. The first thing I want to do to create the infinite scroll is to create a component called app infinite scroll. I prefixed the component name with app so that this can be a reusable component throughout our application. And now I'll just paste in the code for this component, and we'll briefly examine what's going on with it together. Normally, for a component like this, I'd just install and import some existing library. But as of the time of this recording, I couldn't find a good infinite scroll component with adequate usage that worked with Vue 3. So, what's going on here? Well, the most important part happens in the mounted hook. Here, a JavaScript intersection observer is set up, and whenever the div in the template is within the visible page, the component emits a load event. If you want to know more about how intersection observers work, you can find a link to the MDN docs in the description. Also, much like an event listener, intersection observers should be cleaned up. So, in the unmounted hook, we tell the observer to stop observing. Finally, we watch a done prop, and whenever the parent component tells this component that it is done loading every page of resources, we can turn off the intersection observer. Also, in the style tag, even though our div in the component never actually displays anything because it has no content or given width or height, we do have a little bit of code to push its position in the DOM up a little higher than it would normally exist. The reason for this is so that we can start calling the next page of resources before we actually reach the end of the current page. This just makes for a little better user experience. Alright, that's the infinite scroll component. Let's now put it to use in the profile page. We want to put it just after the post list component. That way, whenever we reach the end of the list, the app infinite scroll component will intersect with the screen, thus firing the load event, at which time we'll dispatch our action again. And we can tell the infinite scroll component that we're done whenever the length of the user's posts array is equal to the posts count property on the user. Cool. Let's check it out in the browser. When we scroll now, you'll see as we near the end of the first page of posts, the page scroll bar jumps a little, and then we just keep on scrolling into the second page. Pretty sweet. In no time flat, we've got infinite scroll up and working. Let's do one more thing in the profile page component, just to clean things up a bit. Since we're dispatching the fetch auth user's post action more than once with the exact same options, and the action name and the parameter code is a bit verbose, let's make that into a single method and then call the method in the created hook and on the app Infinite Scroll component load event. And in the created hook, let's make sure to wait the fetch user posts action to finish before telling our application that all the data is ready. Also, for this to work, we'll need to return the promise returned by the action dispatch. Alright, I think that should do it. Cool, everything still works. In the next lesson, we'll see how to implement a more traditional pagination on the Threads page with pagination buttons. In the last lesson, we used an infinite scroll feature to paginate the posts on the user profile page. In this lesson, let's take an alternative pagination approach for the Threads page so that you'll be familiar with implementing both, depending on the needs of other applications you might be developing. For the Threads page, we'll use the more traditional pagination buttons as pictured here. In order to do this quickly, we'll use an existing pagination component library. If such libraries exist, are compatible with your project, are stable, and accomplish what you need, it's always a good idea to take advantage of that. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. So, the library that I'm going to use is called Vue3 Pagination by Hinge. It's at a stable version. It's been worked on in the recent past, so I know it's not abandoned. And even though it's not that widely adopted of a solution, it does exactly what we need it to do. And it's the best Vue 3 compatible solution I could find that wasn't wrapped up in an entire library of components like Quasar or Vuetify. So, the first thing we need to do is install it. I'll copy this line here to do so. And I'll add the --save flag to the end so that it saves to our package.json file. Once it's installed, I'll create a file in the plugins directory where we can register the component via a plugin. First, we'll need to import it and its style sheet. Then, we'll export a function that receives the application instance and calls .component on it to register the vpagination component. Then, we'll put the plugin to use in main.js. It's worth noting that making this into a plugin isn't strictly necessary. We could just import the component directly into the project where we needed it, just like it shows in the library's documentation. Or we could have imported it directly into the main.js file and called .component on it there. However, I like to try and keep third-party libraries organized into a single directory, that is, the plugins directory, as much as possible. So that's exactly what we did here. Looking in the docs now, we can see an example of how we should use the component. First, it looks like it takes a page variable that determines which page should be highlighted as the active page, and that will be updated to a different page value whenever the user clicks a different page number button. It also takes a pages property that, I assume, means the total number of pages that we have. Next, it takes a range size prop. I'm not sure exactly what that one does. We can dive into it later if we need it. And it takes an active color prop. This will be useful for styling it to fit better with our application style. Lastly, it emits an update model value event. Listening to this event would be the same thing as watching the page value and executing some logic whenever it changes. Cool. Let's just copy the example as a starting place and use it on the forum page. We want the pagination to show up underneath the list of threads, so we'll put it here. Now we can start working on giving it the props it needs. Let's create a page data property to keep up with what page we're currently on. It should default to 1. Next, we need to know how many total pages of threads exist for the form on this page. This is one downside to the pagination button approach. It adds a little bit more complexity because it has to know how many buttons to show. The infinite scroll approach doesn't care how many pages there are. It just keeps loading them in until there are no more. However, it's not that big of a deal, as you'll soon see. In order to determine the total number of pages, we need to know just two things. We need to know how many threads exist for the form and how many threads we want each page to contain. Since we use 10 posts per page on the user profile page, let's do the same here. Now, in order to get how many threads exist on the forum, we can read the length of the threads property on this.forum. Remember, forum.threads is an array of thread IDs that we are storing in the Cloud Firestore to keep up with what threads belong to what forum. With that, we can do a little math in a computed property to get the total number of pages. Dividing the thread count by the number of threads per page gives us the number of pages we need. Then, running math.ceil, which is short for math.ceiling, on the result rounds the number up to the next whole number. This makes it so that, for example, if we had 12 threads and wanted 10 threads per page, the result of the division problem would be 1.2. We can't really have 1.2 pages, rather, we want 2 pages, with the second page just not being completely full. So the math.ceil does that roundup for us, making 1.2 into 2 pages. Lastly, we'll just want to return the result. And I misspelled math. Let's also create a little safety net here to make sure we never divide by 0. Cool. Now we have the total pages to pass to the pagination component. I'm just going to remove range size because I don't think we're going to need it. For active color, I'll provide a green color from our application. Alright, let's see where that's got us in the browser. Nice, that's some good progress. Let's add a few more styles just to pretty things up a bit. Okay, I think that's a little better. Now we need to handle the real work. What do we do when the page changes? Let's create an action to handle that. In our Threads Vuex module, I'll create a Fetch Threads by Page action. And it's going to take in the thread IDs on the forum, the page number, and how many threads should be on each page. We can just default it to 10. You'll notice this looks a little different than the action we had for the user's post. That's because we've stored the data a little differently, and I want to show you a different approach. Unlike with the user posts, each forum has a key called threads that stores all the IDs of the corresponding threads. That's what the IDs parameter corresponds to here. So, what we want to do is break all those IDs into separate pages, and then only dispatch fetch threads for that page of IDs. Thankfully, Lodash has a super handy function that can do that for us. And since we've already installed it in an earlier lesson, we can just import the function and use it. The name of the function is chunk. Notice how we're specifying just the chunk function here, so that we only import one function and not the whole Lodash library. Let's take a look at the example of chunk in the docs so that you get a better understanding of how it works. We see here that chunk takes an array for its first argument, and then a number that specifies how many items we want each chunk, or page, to contain. So, an array of A, B, C, D becomes an array of two arrays, each containing two items each, A, B in the first array, and C, D in the second. Also, if the number of items in the array can't be divided evenly by the provided number, then the last element in the array contains the leftovers. This is perfect. That's exactly how pagination works. So, let's put it to use. We'll call chunk on all the forum IDs that come into our action. And we'll pass it the per page as the number of items we want per chunk. Then we'll get the proper chunk of IDs by targeting the index of the chunk corresponding to the requested page. We have to do the -1 here because arrays are 0 indexed, but our pages are not. Our pages start at 1. The array starts at 0. Finally, we'll dispatch the fetch threads action we've already been using, now just with the limited set of IDs. Over in forum.view, we can replace the fetch threads with our new fetch threads by page action. Also, passing it the forum IDs, the current page, and the threads per page. And we'll need to remap the action accordingly. If we take a look in the browser now, we'll see that the first 10 threads are showing, but all the others are still showing rows, even though their data hasn't been loaded. The reason for this is because our threads computed property is using all the thread IDs that exist on the forum to determine the value of the threads instead of threads being determined by the threads in the store that have this forum's ID. Let's change it to do the latter. We'll look through all the threads in the store, filter for the ones that match this forum's ID, And for our map function, we're no longer working with just an ID anymore, but the whole thread object. So here we would need thread.id. Cool. Now let's handle the page change. The vPagination docs show calling a method on the update model value event. I prefer to just watch the page data property instead. It's essentially the same thing, but watching the page data property means that even if it changes for some reason other than the pagination component updating it, the handler will still fire. And what we want to do when the page changes is we want to dispatch the fetch threads by page action again. We'll also want to dispatch the fetch users action again, as the new threads might be by users that aren't loaded in yet. Don't worry if this looks a little repetitive. It is, and we'll fix that in the next lesson. Let's see what this looks like now. When we click each new page button, the new threads get appended to the list. Let's clear out the existing threads from the store before getting the new pages worth of threads. We'll create a clear threads mutation. And then we'll commit it first thing in our fetch threads by page action. Great, our pagination is working. It's worth noting that some of the differences in implementation in this lesson versus the infinite scroll lesson were not due to the different pagination approaches, but rather to the difference in the way that data was stored for each. Besides storing the thread IDs on the forum itself, we're also storing the forum ID on the thread. So, if you'd prefer to use a Firestore query to do pagination on the threads page, like we did on the profile page, instead of doing the chunk stuff with Lodash, you certainly could, and it would still work with the pagination buttons. In the next lesson, we'll make it so that the page can come from the query string in the URL. That way, you can share a link directly to a specific page. Our pagination feature's working great. If we wanted to share the link for the second page to a friend, though, how would we do that? Well, right now we can't. But if we had the pagination info in the URL, like page equals 2, then we could. Let's do that in this lesson. View Router actually makes this task quite simple. Where we've hard-coded our page to start out as 1, let's instead look for the page query in the URL first. And then, if it's not available, set it to 1. Also, since everything that comes from the query string is, well, a string, let's use parseInt to turn the page number into a number. This will ensure the value is a predictable type and plays well with the vPagination component. Now, when we watch the page data property, instead of fetching the data again, we'll just navigate to the new route with the query variable page changed. And since the route has changed, the page component will be destroyed and re-rendered. So the created hook will rerun, taking care of the data fetching automatically. Alright, the first page loads correctly. Clicking on page 2 correctly updates the URL. However, we get stuck with this loader spinning forever. Let's check app.view to make sure it's destroying the page correctly on route change. I see. The key is set to route.path. And since we haven't actually changed the path at all, rather just the query string, the component is not being destroyed and re-rendered. Therefore, the created hook is not firing again. Let's update that key to include the query string as well. I've used json.stringify here so that we can observe the entire query at once. Great, everything's working as we'd expect it to. And if we want to share a particular page of threads with someone, now we can do it. In this chapter, we're going to build a notification system for the forum application. This is a common need in SPAs and is easier than you think. The notifications in our forum application will be for notifying a user when the thread they are looking at is updated or is posted to by someone else. To prepare for this feature, let's take care of an issue that will prevent us from successfully implementing the notifications. In order to support our not found page for the thread show page, we dispatch the fetch thread action in the before enter navigation guard. Then, we also dispatch thread show again in the created hook of the thread show page. Doing this in both places sets up two snapshot events on the thread. That's going to cause issues with our notifications and really isn't necessary otherwise. So, I want to make sure that we only have a single snapshot event for the thread. To do that, let's update the fetch item action to take a once option. Using once will immediately unsubscribe from the snapshot as soon as it's created. I'll also add a console login here so that we can better visualize this working. Then, we can use the once option in the navigation guard. Lastly, we'll need to update the fetch thread action itself to take in the once option and then pass it on to the fetch item action. Now, over in the browser, when I visit a thread, I see the message logged to the console. That means we're successfully getting the thread just once in the navigation guard. Great, let's remove that console log. Now, supporting the new option like this works. However, this could get pretty tedious if we want all the specific fetch resource actions, like fetch user, fetch post, and so on, to accept the once option too, or accept any other future options for that matter. To make things easier on ourselves, let's create a helper function to generate our different fetch resource actions for us. This will be like the higher order function make append child to parent mutation. Its job will be to generate the action for us. So, the first thing we need to do for the make fetch item action function will be to take in the emoji and the resource, since this is what's different per resource. Then, we just return the function that makes up the action itself. We can just go copy and paste this from threads.js. Now, we'll make the emoji and resource reference the ones from the function argument. Then, instead of destructuring the payload, we'll just reference it directly and then spread it into the payload of the dispatched action. This will allow us to arbitrarily add new options to the payload of the fetch item action that will automatically become supported by each of the individual fetch resource actions. While we're at it, I'll do the same thing for fetch items, plural. The only difference between the two is the action that they dispatch. Nice. And with that, we just have to use these two higher order functions. First, we'll import them, and then use them. Let's go check it out in the browser to make sure we didn't break anything. Cool. Still looks good. I'll also do the same for each of the other store modules, but I won't make you watch. The changes will be in the source code for the lesson. In Vue 3, we can write something called a composable. What is a composable? First, it's a separate file from any one component, and thus reusable between multiple components. Second, composables use the Vue 3 composition API in order to expose reactive state and/or functions for use inside of other components. Thus, composables can serve similar functionality to both Mixins and Vuex. This is perfect for a notification system, as applications should be able to spin up notifications from any page or component. It's worth noting we could achieve the same thing with Vuex, but I want to show you an alternative approach, so let's do it. I'll create a composables directory, and then a file, useNotifications.js. The prefix use in the file name is a common convention used when creating composables in Vue.js. Next, we'll create and export a function called useNotifications. This is a necessary step for all composables. Then, I'll create a variable to store all the notifications in. Notice that I'm defining this variable outside of the useNotifications function. This means that no matter which component we use the composable in, they will always refer to the exact same array of notifications. This makes the composable act as a type of global store, like Vuex. We also need to make the notifications reactive. We can do that by importing the reactive function from Vue, and then calling it on the notifications. Without this, the notifications would be stuck in their initial state, and the UI wouldn't update as notifications were added or removed from the array. Calling reactive here is similar to defining reactive data in a component, except that we're not tied to any particular component. Pretty cool. Now we must expose the notifications to the components using the composable by returning it from the useNotifications function. With the notifications now exposed, I want to create a component that will be responsible for displaying them. I'll call it appNotifications.view. I'll just use a VS Code snippet here to quickly scaffold out the component boilerplate. The setup function you see here is a component option made for doing everything related to the Composition API. So, let's import our composable and then use it inside of Setup. Now, we can destructure the notifications from the object returned from the useNotifications composable. And lastly, to expose the notifications from the setup method to the rest of our component, we should return it. Inside the template now, we can print out our notifications. We haven't defined what the individual notifications look like yet, but we'll just assume each is an object with, let's say, a message property. And we'll probably also need an ID to identify each notification. I'll use that for the key attribute. Awesome. Now we can use our component in app.view. I'm choosing to use it in app.view because we want the notifications to be available for display on any page, much like the header. Only when the notifications array is empty, the user won't see anything different. Cool. The page looks the same, but now in the DevTools, we can see the new component. Let's hardcode a couple of notifications in there, just so we can see what they'd look like printed to the page. We said each notification would be an object with a message and an ID property. And I'll just put another one in here for good measure. Okay, let's see what that looks like. Nice, that works. We can see the notifications in the bottom left-hand corner. Let's style them a little bit so that they look more like typical notifications. I'll position them at the bottom right-hand side of the screen and give each of them their own little box to live in. Lastly, I'll make sure the div that I wrapped them in has that class of notifications. Awesome. That looks more like a notification I'm used to seeing. So, obviously, at this point, the hard coded notifications aren't what we're going for. So, let's add the ability to create new notifications. In the composable, we can create a function called add notification. It will take a notification object, like we hard coded above, and it'll push it to the notifications array. Just to make sure the function is easy to use, we can have it randomly generate its own ID for the notification. Now, with our add notification function in place, this means we can add a new notification from absolutely anywhere throughout our project. Since the goal is to notify the user when a thread's content has updated, let's use the add notification function on the thread show page. And once again, call it in the setup function. This time, getting the add notification function from the composable. Then, just to see add notification in action, let's use it to add another test notification. Now, over in the browser, everything broke. What's going on with that? Add notification is not a function. That's because we forgot to return it from our useNotifications function. Alright, give it a refresh now. Awesome. Our dynamically added notification has been added to the bottom of the notifications. Of course, it also makes sense that we should provide a way to remove a notification. We can do that with another function in the composable. It should take in the ID of the notification to remove, and then we can find the index of the specified notification. And use Splice to remove it. Cool. Lastly, let's expose the function. With the remove function in place, we can now use it in app notifications to provide an X button on each notification in order to remove it. First, we'll deconstruct it from the composable, and then we'll return it from setup. Then, we can provide the markup and use a click event listener to call it when the X is clicked. Now, when we check that out in the browser, clicking on the X removes the notification, just like we wanted. Awesome! That's super cool. We were able to add a notification in one component and then remove it in a totally different component, all without the use of Vuex. This nails down the basic functionality of the composable. Let's remove the hard-coded test notifications and the one added in thread show. Now, we're almost ready to start showing the appropriate notifications for an updated thread in the next lesson. Before we show the notification when the thread updates, we need a way to run a function every time the snapshot event triggers. Currently, we're resolving a promise when the snapshot fires, which is great for catching the resolved value for the first snapshot event. However, once a promise is resolved, it's resolved for good. It's never going to resolve again. Thus, we need to have the option of providing a callback function to the fetch item action. Then, if the onSnapshot function is provided and is actually a function, then we'll call it in the callback of onSnapshot. We'll also pass it the item fetched, cloning it just to be safe. It's also going to prove useful knowing what the value of the item was before it was updated. To get that, we'll find the item in the state just before its new value from the snapshot is committed. Then, we'll provide that to our callback function as well. And we'll also need to import findById from the helpers. Nice. That should do it. Finally, let's also allow fetch items, plural, to take in an onSnapshot callback function and then pass it on to fetch item. Now, over in the thread show page, in the created hook, we can provide the onSnapshot callback function to fetch thread. And add a notification. Also, so that the add notification function from the composable is available outside of setup, we need to return it. In the browser, if I refresh the page, we get the notification immediately. This is because OnSnapshot runs the very first time, not because of an update to the data, but as part of our initial data fetching. We can handle that. Before adding the notification, we'll check async data status ready, which is only true at the end of the created hook after all the initial data is loaded. If it's false, then the initial data for the page has not all loaded yet, so the snapshot event in question is for the initial load of the data. Thus, we can return early and not add the notification. Now, in the browser, when we reload the page, we do not get the notification. However, if I open up the same page in a new tab and add a new post, you'll see I get the notification in the other tab. Very cool. However, there are two things that are still an issue. First, the tab that we make the change in shouldn't really need the notification. And secondly, the other tab doesn't have the new post shown in the thread. Let's fix these one at a time. To fix the first issue, what we really want to do is say something like, if the update was initiated locally, then don't show the notification. So, how do we know the value of is local? This is actually something we can get from the Firestore. Local rights in your application will invoke snapshot events immediately. This is because of an important feature called latency compensation. When you perform a write, your listeners will be notified with the new data before the data is sent to the backend. Retrieved documents, therefore, have a metadata has pending writes property that indicates whether the document has local changes that haven't been written to the backend yet. So, we can pass this to the onSnapshot callback and then use it in the thread show page. I'll also just clean this up a bit and check both conditions together. This time, when we create a new post, it only notifies the other browser tab. Perfect. Now, let's handle the second issue. The reason the new post doesn't show up is because while the post IDs stored in the thread are updated in the Firestore, hence the snapshot event firing, the actual post itself is never fetched. So, let's fetch the post with the ID that has been newly added to the thread. Since we're already doing this on created, along with fetching any users that might be needed for a post, let's extract that into a method that can be called and created, as well as in the onSnapshot callback. I'll copy and paste it from created and change out a couple things. I'll make the function async, get the IDs from the IDs parameter, and reference the thread via the computed property. Then we'll replace what was in created before with the call to this method. We can call the method once again in onSnapshot. But how do we know which post IDs it needs? We could assume that the last ID in thread.posts is the only newly updated post. However, to be more thorough, we could instead compare the original thread.post to the updated thread.posts. This is where the item and the previous item we passed in to onSnapshot can come in handy. To get the difference between them, I'll call a Lodash function difference, which will return the items that exist in one array, but not in the other. These are the new post IDs. And of course, we'll need to import difference from Lodash. Let's see what it looks like now. Great. This time we see the notification in the other browser tab, and we get the newly added post. All right, that takes care of the notification when adding new posts. But what about when we edit the thread itself? Let's give it a try. First, I'll navigate to a thread that's mine so that I can edit it. Awesome, that works. What about editing the thread content? Hmm, that didn't work. That's because updating the thread content isn't actually updating the thread, but rather the first post of the thread. That also tells me that editing any other post in the thread is also not going to show the notification yet. We'll remedy this in the next lesson. In this lesson, we've got to listen to the on snapshot of the posts as well as the thread. That way, we can display notifications when posts are updated. We should return early for the same reasons we did before, and otherwise add the notification. Cool. Let's try this out in the browser. I'll make an update to a post, and when I hit update, we do have the notification in the other browser tab. But we also got a notification in the tab that we made the edit in. Why is the isLocal variable not working as before? Let's do some console logging to find out. What? It was true, but then it fired again and was false. What in the world is going on here? We didn't have this issue with the threads. Well, it turns out the difference between the two is that when we update a post, we're providing post.edited.add with a server timestamp. This causes the flow with onSnapshot to occur just a little differently than it did before. Instead of it only firing on the local write, it fires once on the local write with a timestamp of null, and then again after the write has been completed server side with the server timestamp. That means we need to add one more condition to our early return. So, if the previous item has an edited property, and the edited property has an at property that's falsy, in our case that's null, then we'll return early. Let's update the post again. Awesome. Now this works. There's one last issue we need to resolve. If we add a new post, you'll see that in the other browser window, we now get two notifications at a time. Now that we've got the onSnapshot callback set up for the posts as well as the thread, we don't need the thread callback to handle any notifying for adding a post. Thus, we'll check the post's length, and If it's greater than 0, then it does have new posts. In that case, we'll just fetch those new posts. Otherwise, if the thread is being updated, we'll send the notification. Perfect. Our notifications are looking great. However, different use cases for notifications require different notification behavior. For instance, sometimes it's worth showing a notification until a user closes it. This is the approach we've taken thus far. It's probably not the best for this use case, however. Instead, we probably want our notifications to close after, say, a few seconds. So, how do we extend our notification composable to be able to handle both? We could add a new property to our notification object called timeout, where we could specify a length of time to show the notification until it automatically goes away. We'll use milliseconds here, as that's what the setTimeout function uses. And we'll do the same where we call addNotification for the thread snapshot. Now, in the composable, we can check if the timeout option exists. And if it does, use it to call remove notification after the specified timeout. To access the ID to pass to remove notification, we'll need to store it in a variable first. Then we can use it in defining the notification and to use for remove notification. Lastly, I want to destructure the notification parameter just to make it a little more clear what a notification object looks like, and to clean up our code just a bit. Alright, let's see what that looks like in the browser. I'll update the thread in one tab, and in the other tab, the notification displays and then disappears after a few seconds. Perfect. We could use this same approach to add any number of useful options to our notifications, such as notification types, like success, error, warning, and so on. Or adding in buttons to some notifications in order to trigger certain actions when clicked. Really, the possibilities are endless, but I'll leave all those different options up to you. Right now, our notifications are a little abrupt and kinda hard on the eyes. Let's give them some transitions to make them look nicer and more noticeable. We can do this by using the built-in transition group component. First, we wrap our notifications in the transition group component. Then, we give the transition component a name. This name will correspond to the class names that we need to target in order to animate the transition. Then, we can provide some styles based off the different states the transition group component gives to each of the notifications. This starts by giving the notification divs a transition of half a second. Then it says that right at the time the div is inserted into the DOM, give it a 0 opacity and move it over to the right 100% of its width. This class exists until one frame after the element is inserted, thus giving the element the appearance of fading in and moving to the left. The same is applied to leave, just in reverse. This style makes the notification glide smoothly to its new position once another notification is added underneath it. Alright, let's see how it looks. Oh yeah, I like that. For our user registration, we allow the user to provide a URL for their avatar. A more realistic way of doing this would be to allow the user to upload an image. We can do that with Firebase Storage. To get started with Firebase Storage, we can navigate to the Firebase console and click on the Storage tab. Then we can click Get Started. This presents us with the default rules for Firebase Storage. What this says is allow anyone who is authenticated with our application to read and write to any file. We'll change these in just a bit to fit our needs. Next, we need to choose the physical location of our storage bucket. Just like with the Firestore database, you should choose whichever location is closest to your website's audience. If that is unknown, feel free to choose whatever is closest to you. It might take just a second to set up the storage bucket. We'll let it do its thing, and we'll get started in the code. In register.view, we can change the type on the avatar input to file. I'll also remove the vModel, as we'll be handling the file input on the change event. And on change, we can run a method called handleImageUpload. Since the user hasn't registered yet, I don't want to actually upload the file to Firebase Storage. This will help us with the storage rules in a minute and keep unused uploads from bloating our storage if the user bails before finishing registration. Instead, I just want to show the user a preview of the image. That way, they get some good user feedback that the image was indeed uploaded. We can get the image from the event using e.target.files and the index of 0. I'll save it to this .form.avatar. That way, it'll be available on the form for submission. Files is a special JavaScript object called a file list containing all the files that the user chose. We just need the first one since they're only uploading a single image. Then, in order to get a URL that we can use in an image source attribute to display the image, we need to use a file reader. On load of the file that will pass to the reader in just a second, we want to set a data property to the result of the file reader's load event. This means we will need to initialize the avatar preview data property, and I'll just start it out as null. Finally, the last thing we want to do is to tell our file reader to read the avatar as a data URL. With that, we can show the image in the template whenever the avatar preview exists. I'm choosing to place the image inside of the label. That way, if the user uploads the wrong image, they can simply click on the image preview to pull up the file finder again. Which also means we can hide the file input when the preview exists. It's necessary to use vShow here and not vIf. That's because we still want the label to reference a valid file input. That way, the browser knows what to do when we click on the label. Awesome. Let's see how far that gets us. I notice that in the File Finder, I am allowed to choose file types other than image. Let's fix that. I'll break up the attributes on this input tag here since they're getting so long. And we can specify what file types to accept by providing the accept attribute. We'll allow any type of image. Yeah, that's better. Now the non-image files are grayed out and unselectable. I can also select my desired avatar image and see it as a preview. Perfect. Now when the user clicks register, we should actually upload the image to the Firebase storage, and then save the URL of that image to the Firestore database as the avatar. Since we already have the file on the form data, we can take care of uploading the file in the register user with email and password action with the rest of the inputs. The first step in uploading a file to Firebase storage is to get a reference to the root of your storage bucket. Then, we can use the child method to specify the path and the file name of the image to upload. I'll nest these images under an uploads directory to segment all our user uploaded files from any storage we might need internally. Then, a directory that is the same as the user's auth ID. This will help make the avatar writable only by the current user when we create our storage rules in a few minutes. And then lastly, it'll reside in an images directory. This will allow us to validate the file type on the server side, ensuring that the user has uploaded an image. We'll use the file name that was on the uploaded file, prefixed with a timestamp. The timestamp ensures a file name doesn't conflict with another file name that the user has previously uploaded. Then, to initiate the upload, we call the put method, passing it the file. We'll wait for the upload to complete, and then get the URL for the image in order to store in the Firestore. Lastly, we only want to do all of this if the user actually provides an avatar. Now, when we complete the registration process in the browser, our image is uploaded successfully and we see it in all the right places. In the next lesson, we'll secure the images with the Firebase storage rules. Firebase Storage has security rules just like Firebase Firestore has for securing the files in our bucket. We can access them under the Rules tab under Storage. The first thing I'll do is remove the boilerplate rule that Firebase gave us out of the box. Now, to define our own rules, we need to target files with a match statement, using curly braces to stand in for variable parts of the file path. Then, we want to allow read to anybody and everybody, since everyone should be able to see any user's avatar. Then, we want to restrict the writing of our image to just the user who uploaded it. Notice here that we can access the authenticated user on the request just as we could with the Firestore rules. Also, user ID comes from the path segment we specified in the match above. While we're here, we'll also ensure that anything uploaded to the user's image folder is in fact an image. We can do that by checking the content type on the resource in the request. And that should do it. Now anyone can view our profile images, but only the user who uploaded it can write to it. That is, modify its metadata or delete it. In this lesson, let's provide the user a way to edit their avatar. We'll do that by making the profile picture here clickable. We can accomplish this using the label and file input trick from the previous lesson. First, I'll wrap the image in the label, and then provide the associated file input. And it'll only accept images, just like before. In this case, we never want the input to actually display, because there's already an existing avatar, so we can hide it with a vShow equals false. While we're in this component, I also want to fix an issue that's been hiding for a little while. Let's add a .prevent to the click event on the cancel button. Without the .prevent here, the form actually submits on the click of cancel and saves as though we clicked save. Not sure when and where that got wonky, but it's fixed now. Anyways, back on the file input, we'll use the change event to handle the avatar upload. Before we define this method though, let's extract the logic in the register user with email and password action that handles the avatar upload into its own action. That way, we can use it for editing the avatar, as well as on the registration page. I'll call the new action Upload Avatar. And it will take in the auth ID and the file to upload. First, we'll just return null if the file isn't provided. Then, we'll make the auth ID optional by setting it to the auth ID in the state if it's not provided as part of the payload. Why can't we just get it from the state every time? Well, because then it wouldn't be usable on the registration page, where the auth ID isn't yet available in the state. Next, we'll paste in the uploading logic from above, changing out variables as necessary. This becomes auth ID. We'll change avatar to file. And finally, get the URL and return it. Now, we can replace the logic in the register user with email and password action with a call to our new action. And that should do it. Back in the profile card editor component, we can now map the action we just created. With that, we're ready to define the method that we called on the onChange of the file input. It will get the file from the event and then call the upload avatar action on it. This gets the file uploaded to Firebase storage, but we also need to save the URL of the new file to the Firestore as the user's avatar. The active user data property holds the data that will ultimately get sent to the Firestore, so we need to set its avatar property to the URL of the avatar that's returned from upload avatar. Great. Let's see how this looks in the browser. When we click on the user avatar, we're able to choose a new image, and then nothing happens. Or at least it looks like nothing happens. If I give it a few seconds just to ensure the upload is complete, and then click on Save to commit my profile changes, sure enough, the profile image is updated. Awesome. With that, the basics are working. Now we just need to provide some better user feedback. We'll do that in the next lesson. In this lesson, let's improve the UI for editing an avatar. The first bit that I want to take care of is to make it more obvious that the user can click on the avatar to update it. I'll do that by overlaying a Font Awesome camera icon on top of the profile image. First, we'll need to import the icon in our Font Awesome plugin and register it. Then, we'll use the icon in the template of the profile card editor. I'll also increase its size using the component's size prop and style it using just a little CSS. Lastly, to position it correctly, I'll wrap it in a div with the class of Avatar Upload Overlay. Also, giving the wrapping p tag a class of Avatar Edit. And finally, I'll throw a few more styles in the style sheet. Nice. Let's see how that looks. Cool. That looks more clickable. Now, let's replace the camera icon with our app spinner while the avatar is uploading. To do that, we can initiate an uploading image data property to false. And then set it to true just before doing the upload. And then back to false again when the upload is complete. Lastly, we'll show the app spinner instead of the icon in the template when uploading image is true. All right, let's check it out. I'll upload a new image, and this time we see the spinner until the upload is complete. The spinner's a bit dark though. Let's make it so that the app spinner component can take in a color prop. It will be a string and default to the color it's already using. But how do we use this? The color is being used in the style tag. Can we bind a rule and a style tag to a component prop? Actually, yes, we can. Well, almost. At the time of this recording, Vue 3.2 was just released, and it provides support for binding component data in the style tag. So the first thing we need to do is update Vue to 3.2. Depending on when you started the course, you might already be at 3.2 or higher. To see what version you have installed, you can look for Vue in packagelock.json. I have 3.0.4 here. If we take a look at the package.json file though, we see that the version of Vue specified is 3.0.0, and it has this little caret in front of it. Not going to lie, versioning with npm confused me for probably longer than it should have, but it's really not that difficult. What this caret is doing is saying any version of Vue that's in the major version 3 is acceptable for this project. Thus, when running npm update Vue, npm will install the latest version of Vue within major version 3. Now, if we inspect the version of Vue in the package log.json, you'll see that it's updated. So, there's a quick little lesson on versioning with npm. Let's get back to styling the spinner. Unfortunately, the feature doesn't seem to support directly binding props inside the style tag. So, first, let's set a data prop to the color prop. Then, we can use a vbind function in the style tag. Yeah, I agree. That's pretty stinking sweet. Let's provide white for the prop in the card editor and see if it worked. Very nice. The spinner is now white. The last thing we need to do to fix the UI is replace the displayed avatar with the newly uploaded avatar. To do that, we just need to replace the source of the image with the active user.avatar. This works because the active user is initiated to the user prop, so it gets the saved avatar to begin with. But in the handle avatar upload method, we update the active user.avatar for submitting to the Firestore on save. Simple enough. Now, if we check things out in the browser one last time, perfect. And for good measure, let's save and refresh. Let's also try out switching the avatar, but then clicking cancel. All right, we're good to go. Let's take care of notifying the user when an image upload fails. The easiest way I know to trigger an error from Firebase is to upload a file type that's not allowed. That said, let's temporarily remove the accept attribute on the file input. Then, in the upload avatar action, let's wrap our call to Firebase storage in a try catch. And for now, we'll use the browser native alert function to let the user know that there's an error. Also, I'm choosing to use a more generic error message here instead of using the error returned from Firebase, as it might be confusing to the end user. Now, when I upload a file that's not the correct type, sure enough, I get the error message. But now my avatar is also broken. In the profile editor component, let's only reassign the active user.avatar if we were given back the URL of the uploaded image. To do that, I'll store the return from the upload avatar action into a variable, and then assign active user.avatar to that variable. Or, if the variable is falsy, just assigning the user's avatar back to itself. Now I'll test it out again. I'll add another file that's not an image. We still get the alert, and the old avatar stays in place. Since we have our notifications composable, let's use it now to notify the user of the error instead of using the alert. In auth.js, I'll import the composable. Then, inside of our catch, use the composable to add a notification. Cool. Now, if we check it out in the browser, we get the notification as we'd expect. However, it doesn't really scream something went wrong. To make it more apparent that the notification is an error, let's quickly implement the error type option that we mentioned in passing in the notifications lesson. I want to be able to pass in a type like this. To do that, let's add the type option to our add notification function in the composable. I'll default it to info and add it to the object pushed to the notifications. Then, in the app notifications component, we'll support the new option by adding a type class to the notification. And then, provide a different color left border for the type error. So really, all the type is doing is changing the color of that border. But it effectively lets the user know what type of notification it is. Let's see how that looks now. Okay, cool. I think that works pretty well. Let's go ahead and put the accept attribute back on the file input, since we're done with that testing. In closing, it's worth noting that though this particular error should never be possible, as we do have the accept attribute provided on the input, there are plenty of possible errors that this accounts for. You can see all the possible errors listed in the Firebase documentation. We just used the example we did, as it was the easiest to reproduce. So far, everything is working great for when a user has provided an avatar. But what if they choose not to? If I register a new user and don't provide an avatar, now in the header and the profile and all the other places that we should have an avatar, we have this ugly broken image. Obviously, this is not ideal. Let's provide a generic avatar placeholder for those who don't want to provide their own. I'm going to use this avatar image provided on Wikimedia Commons under the Creative Commons license. It's always important to read and understand the licenses of imagery you use from around the web. In this case, we're free to share and remix the work however we want, so long as we provide attribution by linking to this page, as I've done in the description below. Cool. Now I'll download it and add it to the public directory of our project. I'll also rename it user placeholder.png. Now, in the profile editor component, we can check to see if the avatar is provided. Otherwise, we'll show the placeholder avatar. Sweet. I think that works out pretty well. I could do the exact same thing in all the other places where an avatar is used, but that could become a maintenance nightmare, having to remember to always provide the placeholder as a backup. That's no good. So, let's create a component to take care of that cognitive load for us. I'll call it App Avatar Image. I've prefixed it with app so that we know it's meant to be a reusable component throughout the application. We'll allow the component to take in the source as a prop and Then we'll provide the source to an image tag and default to the placeholder, just as we did a second ago. Then, we can use it inside of the profile editor and remove the placeholder backup. Awesome. The placeholder is still in place, but we didn't have to manually provide it. Now, let's switch out the normal image tags in all the other places where the avatar is used with our new App Avatar Image component. I'll start with the navbar, and then the regular profile card. Next, the avatar image is also used in the post list. And lastly, the thread list. Now, over in the browser, if I go check it out in all these different places, sweet, yeah, it's looking good. I'll also create a new thread real quick so that we can see it working in the post list and the thread list. Great. This has made not providing an avatar a real viable option for our users. Believe it or not, sometimes users can't be bothered with providing their own avatar. Let's make it easy for them by allowing them to select a random one. Here, you'll see what we'll be making. On the Profile Edit page, we display a random avatar button. When we click it, the avatar is randomly selected. And we can do this as many times as we'd like. Then on Save, the avatar is saved as the user's avatar. Cool. In order to support this feature, we're going to be using the royalty-free stock image site, Pixabay. Pixabay provides a great selection of images that are free to use anywhere and for anything. Plus, they provide a great REST API for searching through their image database right from our own application. To get started, let's check out the documentation for the REST API. In order to search through the images, we can make a call to this endpoint. And there are a number of different parameters available to customize the request. The only required parameter, though, is the key. This serves to identify the application making the request and allows Pixabay to rate limit its API users so that no one user or application is slamming them with too many requests. In order to get a key, we've got to create an account first. I already have one, so I'll just log in. But if you don't already have an account, feel free to pause the video and register real quick. It's quick, easy, and free. Once I'm logged in, my API key is displayed right there in the docs. Nice. Now I can make an API request. To see an example of what the API returns, let's make a request directly in the browser. I'll use Firefox for this though, as it provides some nice JSON formatting to make the response easier to read. What we get back is a JSON object with a total key, a total hits key, and a hits key. The hits here is really what we're interested in. It provides an array of 20 images, and each image has an assortment of information about it. Cool. There's one more thing that we can add to the URL to get back images related to a certain search term. Let's add a Q parameter, which I assume stands for query, and then provide the search term. I'll use cats. Now, as we look through the images returned, you'll see that they all have the term cat or something similar somewhere in their tags. Great, this is all we need to know about the API in order to get our random avatar generator working. Let's head on over to the code and start working on the UI for our new feature. I'll start by creating a new component. I'll call it User Profile Card Editor Random Avatar.view. Yeah, I know it kind of sounds like a mouthful, but I've prefixed it with User Profile Card Editor, as it will only be used in the Profile Card Editor. Alright, next I'll provide the markup for the button, and also the bit of grayed out text underneath it saying Powered by Pixabay. This part is important, as it's part of the agreement we make with Pixabay by using their API. We need to give them credit where credit is due. Now, we'll add a click handler to the button so that we can make our API request when the user clicks it. In order to get random results, let's make a list of random search terms. These can be literally whatever you want. They can be geared more towards the theme of your application or just any random word. Feel free to copy these from the source code for this lesson, or just come up with a list of your own. Next, we need a way to randomly choose one of these search terms. Let's create a helper function called ArrayRandom to do this for us. First, I'll target a random index in the array by multiplying the length of the array with math.random, and using math.floor to round it to the lowest whole number. Then, I'll return the element at that index. Great. Now let's import the helper function and use it to get a random word from our search terms. Now, all that's left to do is to make a request to the API. We can make an API request by using the native browser function fetch. I'll provide the API URL with my key hard-coded in it, as well as the random word. You might think that exposing the API key on the client side like this is dangerous, but in this case, it's not really. The reason is because literally anybody can go grab an API key for Pixabay and get access to the exact same things. So there's really no motivation for anyone to ever steal or abuse anyone else's API key. After the request is made, we'll store the response in a variable and get the return JSON data from the response. Now remember, the response contains a hits property containing 20 different images. Let's randomly choose one of them. And the property that we're really interested in on the random image is the web format URL. This is a medium-sized version of the image with a max width or height of 640 pixels, which will be perfect for our avatar. Next, let's omit this from the component so that we can access it in the User Profile Card Editor to set the image. We'll call the event hit. With that, we're ready to use our new component in the Profile Card Editor. And, on hit, we'll set the active user's avatar to the random image URL emitted from the component. And I can't forget to import the component and register it. Let's try it out in the browser. We'll click on Random Avatar, and that didn't work. That's because the form is submitting. We need to add a .prevent to our button. Alright, cross your fingers. Awesome. Now we've got a random image. However, some of them are a little squished because they're not all exactly square. We can fix that with just a single line of CSS. That did it. And now, when we click Save, the image sticks around because the URL for it has been saved to the Cloud Firestore. This is all looking great, but there is one last thing we need to do. Right now, we're hot linking the random images, and we really shouldn't be. We'll talk about that more in the next lesson. While we've got the random images working, right now we're hot linking them directly from Pixabay. What do I mean by that? If we take a look at the image source in the element inspector, you see that the URL points to the Pixabay servers. This is not something Pixabay wants us doing. In their API documentation, they expressly say returned image URLs may be used for temporarily displaying search results. However, permanent hot linking of images, that is, using Pixabay URLs in your app, is not allowed. This means we're good hot linking the image just for temporary display when we click the random image button. But if the user chooses the image as their avatar, we need to download the image from Pixabay, save it to Firebase storage, and then link to the image in Firebase storage for continuous display of the chosen avatar. Alright, to do this, let's create a method in the user profile card editor component to handle this for us. First, we'll check if the avatar is a randomly generated one. We can do this by checking to see if the URL starts with the Pixabay URL. Then, if it is a randomly generated avatar, we'll use fetch to turn the image into a blob. Before, we passed a file from a file input to Firebase in order to store the image. But since this image didn't come from a file input, the other option is to send it to Firebase storage as a blob. That means that we can now call the upload avatar action and pass it the blob. Also, since blobs don't have file names, like files uploaded with a file input, let's pass a file name as well. And in the action, we can use the provided file name if it exists. Otherwise, we can just continue to use the name on the file. Now, we've uploaded the image to Firebase storage, and we just need to tell the form about the Firebase storage URL. And run our method on save. this time when I choose a random image and save it as my avatar. When we look in the DevTools, you can see that the source points to Firebase and not Pixabay. Perfect.